Thank you, Grant. Nice to see so many people here tonight, including quite a few friends and former colleagues. My ex-rival from Newsweek, Chris Dickey, has threatened to heckle all the way through this. So I hope he doesn't do that. But if he does, I'm sure it will be done with wit and style. So, how many of you are familiar with the Bettencourt Affair? That's just about everybody. Is anybody not? Okay. Well, just a quick summary. It's a French scandal, as you know, involving the world's richest woman, who was L'Oréal heiress Liliane Bettencourt, and her much younger gay protege, Francois-Marie Banier, to whom she gave several €100 million over 20 years. And of course, Liliane's daughter, Françoise, who in 2007 sued Banier for exploiting her elderly mother, and thus launched an epic legal battle that lasted for about 10 years. But I saw a broader story than that. I actually started in 1870, not in 2007, but in 1870 with the Franco-Prussian War. Don't worry, I only spent a page on that. But I did see it as the story is something more complex and richer than simply an account of the legal battle. In fact, it's many different stories intertwined, and to some extent it's a corporate history. It's the story of the creation and transmission of one of the world's great fortunes. It's the saga of a family through 3 generations, a remarkable family in many ways, marked by achievements, but also with some dark clouds. It's also, I think, part of it's a Greek tragedy about a conflicted relationship between a mother and a daughter, and a family torn apart by jealousy and vengeance. And it's also, of course, a political intrigue, which was one of the factors in the downfall of a president, or at least the president's inability to be reelected or revived as recently as last year. So I think there are all these intertwined plots and subplots, but one thing that's really central to the whole thing is the people, the characters. Because what attracted me to this subject, first of all, was not the enormous amount of money involved, but it was the characters, the intriguing characters, and the interplay between them. And so, with the characters as a centerpiece, I tried to tell the story in a novelistic way. Now, it's entirely factual and meticulously documented, as you can count the 60 pages of endnotes if you if you want. But it is a work of nonfiction. But I tried to use literary techniques of fiction, scene setting, characterization, description, and sense of place, and those tools, applying tools of fiction writing to a work of nonfiction. And I, of course, did not invent this technique. It goes, I don't know how far back it goes, but the Truman Capote famously dubbed this the nonfiction novel when he came out with In Cold Blood. And I think it was 1966. So let's take a look at these characters. First of all, you have Eugene Schueller, who is the son of an Alsatian baker and a domestic servant, who became a chemist and invented the synthetic hair dye that was at the origin of L'Oréal. And Schueller was really a brilliant inventor and businessman. He actually started L'Oréal in a kitchen laboratory, and he built it up into the world's biggest cosmetic firm. He was a workaholic. He called himself the 6,000-hour man because he worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, almost never took vacation. But he had a serious flaw. He had a penchant for fascist ideology, which led him to fund one of the most notorious far-right groups in the 1930s, and known as the La Cagoule. And during the war, led him to participate or collaborate actively with the Nazi occupiers. In his writings and public speeches and radio chats, he called for a revolution to rid France of what he called republicanism, Freemasonry and Jews. He openly praised Hitler's dynamism, and he called on the French to free themselves of the childish, what he called the childish notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But his collaboration went much further than this rhetorical support for National Socialism. He was in fact an informant of Helmut Knochen, who was the notorious head of the SS security police in France. Knochen was instrumental in the deportations of Jews to the death camps, and also in the executions of thousands of resistance members and hostages. And he named Schueller in his depositions when he was actually captured and interrogated after the war. He named Schueller as one of his agents. And in the Archives Nationales, I discovered a document, a very interesting document written and signed by Schueller, which urges young Frenchmen to join the notorious Légion des Volontaires Français, which was a French volunteer unit that fought alongside the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front. So Schueller, of course, had advantages from his collaboration, and not the least was an advantage to his bottom line. During the war years, L'Oréal's sales actually quadrupled, and Schueller's personal income increased tenfold. And a company, a paint and varnish company that he controlled called Valentine, actually sold as much as 90% of its wartime production to the German Navy. So he was in it pretty deep. And after the war, along with a lot of other collaborators, Schueller was caught up in the net of the great post-war purge, l'épuration. He was indicted and investigated, but he escaped conviction largely because of his money and his contacts, including a general who swore that he had actually financed the resistance, and two young men who had become resistance members somewhat belatedly, future President Francois Mitterrand, and Schueller's future son-in-law, André Bettencourt. So that was how he escaped from the l'épuration, and by all rights, he really, in my opinion, should have been convicted. His narrow escape didn't prevent him after the war, however, from welcoming a number of former Nazi supporters into the ranks of L'Oréal. And among them was a notorious killer named Jacques Corrèze, who fought with the Waffen-SS on the Eastern Front and swore allegiance to Hitler. And he was hired by Schueller in 1950, and he actually went on to be the head of L'Oréal's US subsidiary. Then there was Jean Fiol, who allegedly assassinated more than 100 people. And he actually helped the Waffen-SS prepare their infamous massacre in 1944 of the village of Oradour-sur-Glane. And there were a number of other ex-Nazi sympathizers who wound up with jobs, and some of them quite elevated jobs in L'Oréal. Now, Schueller was never taken to task for recycling these war criminals, but a spectacular expose in 1991, years after the founder's death, actually exposed this fact and became a catastrophic public relations situation for L'Oréal and the Bettencourt family. Another main character, obviously, in the book, and maybe the central character, is Schueller's heir and only child. And Liliane was actually born in 1922, and she lost her mother when she was 5 years old. And so she grew up under the influence of her father's domineering personality and manic work ethic. And in fact, she was really completely obsessed with her father and lived and breathed L'Oréal business from childhood. One of her lawyers, Georges Kiejman, once told me that you'll never understand Liliane's story unless you realize that she was the adored daughter of a father she adored. And so Liliane as I say, grew up under the shadow and the influence of this great man. But she was also a very lonely girl. She was raised by an English nanny that she did not like, and a woman who later actually married her widowed father, which was like two strikes against the nanny. She was packed off to a Catholic boarding school run by Dominican nuns, and on the school vacations, she was forced by her father to work as an apprentice at L'Oreal, gluing labels on shampoo bottles and similar kind of low-level tasks. In fact, Schueller never imagined that his daughter would one day wind up running the company. He thought that a woman's place was in the home, keeping house and raising kids. And when it came time for Liliane to marry, Schueller had a hand-picked candidate in mind, and that was André Bettencourt, the young Vichy supporter turned resistance member who had vouched for him during his investigation after the war. Now, Bettencourt came from a prominent provincial family in Normandy. His staunchly Catholic father was a lawyer, and his mother's family had some aristocratic blood. André himself was tall, handsome, elegant in manner and speech. And in Schueller's eyes, he would be a great catch because Schueller was, he was a nouveau riche son of a baker and a domestic servant. And he thought that a marriage between Liliane and André Bettencourt would give her the social status that he lacked. And André was only too happy to marry the heiress to the L'Oreal fortune. But Liliane long resisted André. In fact, she was madly in love. When she was 20, she fell madly in love with the son of a Moroccan pasha. This is quite serious. And she even considered marrying him. And it was only after that torrid affair broke off that she finally agreed to marry André Bettencourt on the rebound. But when they went to choose the ring, she told the jeweler, above all, not too tight. And she later told an interviewer, I detest all the conventions of marriage. In fact, theirs was a marriage of convenience, not of passion. André had an active private life that did not particularly involve women. And Liliane enjoyed her own personal freedom. But it was Liliane who wore the pants and controlled the purse. It was her money that bought André's handmade suits and his Havana cigars and financed his political career. He had cabinet positions, mostly low or middle-level cabinet positions, in a number of governments after the war. But without his political contributions under the table in the brown envelopes, he probably never would have been asked to join a government. Because in fact, André Bettencourt was a rather mediocre man. He quit school before the baccalaureate. He avoided military service in spite of the wartime draft, the Mobilisation Générale. And throughout his long political career, some 50 years in politics, he did not leave his name on a single piece of legislation or political initiative, nor, in spite of his lofty vice president's title at L'Oreal, did he have an important role in the family business. He did have one moment in the spotlight that came in 1995 when Le Monde revealed the fact that he had written anti-Semitic diatribes in a newspaper supported by the Germans in 1941. In 42, before he switched sides and joined the resistance. But long before that, Liliane had gone through a period of a deep depression. Because all of her life, what was her life about? All of her life, she was the daughter of, or the wife of. But she felt unfulfilled in her personal life. She was bored with her marriage, dissatisfied with her daughter, Françoise, with whom she had a fraught relationship. She occupied herself with L'Oreal meetings and social events and dinner parties. But in fact, she was bored with her codified bourgeois existence and really longed for something more exciting. She once told an interviewer from the avant-garde magazine, L'Égoïste, in 1987, she said, "I don't like blandness, I like salt." Well, salt came into her life in the person of Francois-Marie Banier, who was sent to photograph her on the occasion of that interview. Now, Banier was a character from a Balzac novel, really, Rastignac or Lucien de Rubempré, a relentless social climber intent on conquering the tout Paris. He was the battered son of a Hungarian immigrant father and an egocentric French mother. And he grew up seeking in others the affection and approval that was lacking in his own home. He left home at age 16 and formed intimate friendships with a whole succession of famous people, among them Salvador Dali, Vladimir Horowitz, Yves Saint Laurent, Louis Aragon, François Mitterrand. Mitterrand loved him, and many other people. And he wasn't really, you couldn't really say that he was a celebrity stalker, because he brought something to the party as well. He was attractive. He was quite an Adonis in his youth. He was charming. He was witty, and he attracted attention with his, as I say, his conversation, but also his literary talents, precocious that they were. He was compared by Louis Aragon, who was a very close friend of his, to Stendhal and Turgenev. Well, that praise was obviously excessive, but the fact is that Banier had actually published 3 successful novels by the time he was 25. He was a curious and talented dilettante who also took up painting and photography, which is what led him to that fateful photo session with Liliane Bettencourt in 1987. Well, Banier showed up at the Bettencourt mansion in Neuilly, and he immediately made an impression on Liliane, because unlike most people who would take a fawning attitude in the presence of the L'Oreal heiress, Banier began to boss her around. He didn't like her hairdo, he made her change her clothes, he told her where to sit, how to pose. Instead of kicking him out, she fell under his spell. And that was the beginning of an intense 25-year relationship between the two of them. She once told an interviewer, "Banier has given me a life." And so, what did he do? How did he do that? Well, he paid a lot of attention to her. He took her out of that stuffy world she was kind of vegetating in. He took her to art galleries and the theater and auction houses, and introduced her to interesting people, writers and actors and artists, and really gave her a new lease on life. So she repaid him in the only way she knew how, with money. Hundreds of millions of euros over 20 years. And of course, Banier cajoled her and manipulated her and encouraged her largesse. But interestingly, Liliane Bettencourt always made it clear that she was acting willingly and knowingly in order to further Banier's career as an artist. Well, Françoise, what do you think Françoise made of all this? She looked on it with what you might call a jaundiced eye. And shortly after her father's death, about a month after her father's death in 2007, she filed suit against Banier for abus de faiblesse, or elder abuse, I guess you'd call it, for exploiting her elderly mother. And Françoise claimed that she was doing this to protect her mother from Banier. And certainly that's true to a certain extent, but I think she also had many other motivations. One central motivation is the fact that Françoise and Liliane had a terrible relationship. Liliane was elegant, she was social, she was passionately interested in the family business. Françoise was dowdy, withdrawn, more interested in her books and her piano than the exciting social life of her parents. And in Liliane's eyes, Francoise just never measured up to her expectations. It's a very sad story in many ways. Liliane once said about Francoise, Francoise was always one lap behind me. And so Banier comes into the picture. And of course, Francoise is terribly jealous of him. Who is he? He's this brash interloper who comes into the household and usurps Francoise's place in her mother's affections. And so she launched this suit, which is the subject of this legal battle that we all know about. So those are the main characters, but there are dozens of fascinating lesser figures. In fact, Charles Dickens couldn't have invented a more colorful set of characters or a more convoluted plot. Let's look at some of the secondary figures. Well, you have Olivier Metzner, who was a legendary criminal lawyer, the one who actually masterminded the suit, and who committed suicide before it was over. Then you had the handsome movie star, handsome butler, Pascal Bonnefoy, who secretly recorded Liliane's meetings with her advisors and over a year, and blew the case wide open. And then, of course, you have Claire Thibault, that helmet-haired accountant who blew the whistle on Banier and wound up being investigated herself for false testimony. And of course, we can't forget the smarmy financial advisor, Patrice Demestre, who was later indicted for sweet-talking Liliane out of 12 million euros, and of course, famously begging her to buy him the boat of his dreams. Yes, and at the end of this whole process, he was actually convicted and definitively. He didn't appeal, and at the end of the process, he was stripped of his Légion d'honneur medal, which is something very dear to him, and this whole case ultimately spilled over, and with the publication of the tapes and their contents, it became apparent that there was some strange relations, strange things going on between Eric Wirth, who was President Sarkozy's cabinet member and campaign treasurer, between him and Demestre, involving campaign contributions, but also what would I call conflicts of interest involving an apparent trade-off of this famous Légion d'honneur decoration for a cushy job for Wirth's wife. And finally, we get to Nicolas Sarkozy himself. Sarkozy is a fascinating character for his frenetic energy and his ruthless ambition, and also his ethical lapses that embroiled him in a number of scandals, and prominent among them, of course, was the Bettencourt Affair. Now, Sarkozy didn't like this suit from the beginning for a number of reasons, and one of them was the fact that L'Oréal seemed to be a situation where L'Oréal might be vulnerable to a takeover by its Swiss junior partner, Nestlé. So, as the president of France, of course, Sarkozy was concerned, because L'Oréal was a fleuron, a kind of a flagship industry that France was very proud of, especially in the kind of luxury and fashion area that's so important to France's identity. And also, it was financially important. They were major employers, big taxpayers. So Sarkozy didn't like this suit, and he wanted to see it shut down. So the first thing he did was he offered to mediate between Françoise and her mother. Now, this is a rather extraordinary thing. The president of a country offers to mediate between parties in what at that time was just a family quarrel. Well, that didn't work. Liliane didn't want it, and next thing he did was he allegedly, apparently pressured the prosecutor, Philippe Courroy, to quash the case. And finally, Sarkozy found himself under investigation for allegedly taking illegal contributions from the Bettencourt family. So the Bettencourt Affair was something that really tarnished his image, and it was one of the many what the French call casseroles that he kind of dragged along behind him. It was one of the factors in his failure to win re-election in 2012, and also it helped scuttle his comeback hopes last year. And he's not done with it yet, because when was it? In October, the Paris prosecutor ordered Sarkozy to stand trial in the famous wiretap affair, which involved Sarkozy's attempts to obtain protected judicial information about, among other things, the Bettencourt Affair. So those are some of the secondary characters, and you can see that if you put that together with the main characters, you have the means to put together an interesting story, and as I tried to do it in a somewhat novelistic way. Now, I'm not going to talk you through all the stages of the legal battle. You have to buy the book for that. It's all in there. But I think most of you probably know the outcome. I'll give it to you in a nutshell. At the appeal trial last year, Banier was convicted, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. But the prison sentence was entirely suspended, so no jail time. He was also fined 375,000 euros, a mere pittance for him. But the 158 million euro damages that were assessed at the first trial were actually rescinded on appeal. So Banier actually got off with a relative wrist tap. But at age 70, he's in many ways a broken man. His reputation is tarnished, if not shattered. He's a convicted felon. And his life was really tormented through a whole decade of this trial, or this legal battle. Liliane's last decade was also poisoned by the affair. She was lost in the fog of Alzheimer's in the end, and she wound up spending her last days under the guardianship of her daughter Francoise, which was exactly the fate that she always dreaded. The big winner in all this, of course, was Francoise. Not only did she prevail in her suit against Banier, but now that her mother has passed away, she's inherited Liliane's 33% share of L'Oréal, which is worth, at last count, something over $45 billion, which makes Francoise now the world's richest woman. And she also got out from a legal cloud of her own. For the last year, she's been under investigation for allegedly bribing her star witness, the accountant Claire Thibault. But the prosecutor recently, I think in August, recommended that those charges be dropped, pending a final judicial approval of that. So for all intents and purposes, the legal phase of the Bettencourt Affair is now over. So some people wonder why I wanted to write a book about this, or how I chose this as a subject. I'm sure you're all wondering yourselves. Actually, it chose me. The subject chose me. I came here in the summer of 2010. I go back and forth between Paris and New Orleans, where I grew up. So at that time, I was spending my summers over here. So I came over here for a summer, let's say summer vacation, 2010. The Bettencourt Affair was all over the press, all over the French media. That was shortly, it was around the time that the famous recordings were leaked to the press. Everybody was talking about Sarkozy's involvement. The press was even talking about a French Watergate. And all these characters, Banier and the money involved, and Liliane, and L'Oréal, I just thought it was a great story. So I emailed Graydon Carter at Vanity Fair, and I said, I thought this would make a great story for the magazine. And he said, yeah, you're right, why don't you do it? Well, I hadn't intended to do it myself. I was on vacation. But I figured, okay, what the hell. And for a penny, out for a pound. So I did the story. It came out in October of 2010 in Vanity Fair. And 3 months later, Banier and Françoise actually signed an agreement which theoretically put an end to the whole suit. But the agreement unraveled and the investigation continued. And when it all went to trial in 2015, my literary agent back in the US read an article about the whole affair in the New York Times. And she was intrigued. She thought this would be a great book for the US market. So she got in touch with me and said, well, why don't you do a proposal? Well, I honestly didn't think it would appeal to the US market. But I said, well, okay, what the hell, in for a penny, out for a pound, right? So it turned out her instincts were right. She had 6 US publishers bidding on the book. And we signed with Dutton in May of 2015, turned in the manuscript 18 months later, and the rest is history, as they say. So that's kind of the story about how I got involved in this, following really in 2 stages, once for Vanity Fair and then once for the book. There are a lot more things that I could say about the book and the story, the Bettencourts, L'Oréal. Maybe some of it will come up in the question period. But I'd like to close off here by reading a short section from the book. This is a chapter called The Christmas Visitor, and it recounts a confrontation between one of Liliane's advisors and Francois-Marie Banier about all the money he's been receiving. Tuesday, December 24th, 2002. A man in a tan trench coat emerges from the Saint-Sulpice metro station, crosses the square, and heads down the Rue Servandoni. He stops in front of a pair of dark green doors and presses the bell. A female employee escorts him to a narrow elevator that takes him up to the 4th floor, where Francois-Marie Banier is waiting for him. The table is set for 2. In the adjoining kitchen, Banier's cook prepares to serve lunch. The visitor is an unassuming man of average height, 66 years old, with receding gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. He could pass for an accountant, or perhaps an insurance adjuster. His name is Pierre Castres-Saint-Martin, but everyone knows him as Pascal, because he was born on Easter Day in 1936. Today is the eve of another Christian feast, but Castres is not here to bring tidings of comfort and joy. He is here to scare the hell out of Francois-Marie Banier. The 2 men know each other well. Castres is the financial advisor to Liliane Bettencourt and director of the family holding company that manages her L'Oréal shares and investments. Before that, he spent 2 decades at L'Oréal, serving as legal director, financial director, and finally, deputy director general, the number 2 behind CEO Lindsay Owen-Jones. Since his retirement in 2002, he worked exclusively for Liliane Bettencourt. It was at her urging that Castres met periodically with Banier to advise him on how to manage the substantial funds she had shoveled his way. The 2 men had lunched together at Banier's home several times before. Banier had even offered to give him one of his paintings. Castres declined. It was a modern painting, enormous, he explains. I didn't know what to do with it. Castres knew that Banier had received numerous gifts from Liliane over the years, but he was unaware of the extent until the day she asked him to examine her will and see that everything was in order. Please show him all the documents concerning my succession, she wrote to her notary, Jean-Michel Normand. I have absolute confidence in him and his discretion. When Castres pored over the papers at Normand's office, he was shocked to discover that Madame Bettencourt had made Banier the beneficiary on 4 life insurance policies whose accrued value now reached some 625 million euros. Apart from the notary, no one, not even André, knew that the policies had been put into Banier's name. Castres dashed back to the Bettencourt mansion. Madame, this is madness, he told Liliane. All these dispositions will be contested. The day her will would be unsealed, he warned, her daughter's family would almost certainly sue Banier for captation d'héritage, illegally appropriating an inheritance. In place of the insurance policies, he proposed to offer Banier lifetime annuities, regular stipends for as long as he lived. That way, at least, the will would not be challenged. Castro proposed to talk to Banier and try to reason him into renouncing the policies. She gave me her permission, and I went to discuss the matter with him. No sooner than Castro sat down at Banier's table, he cut to the chase. You're mad to seek such sums from Liliane. Banier played innocent. I never asked for anything. As far as the insurance policies are concerned, I wasn't even aware of them. I've just learned about it. One day Madame will be dead and you will be alone, Castro warned. After she's gone, you will be sued over the succession. But legal action was not the only threat. Nicole Gilbert, Banier's cook, recalled overhearing Castro's chilling scenarios of violent retribution. Quote, he was trembling with rage as he spoke. Concerning the life insurance policies, he said that the mafia would be aware of what was going to be paid to you, and you would be obliged to give it all to them, that they would use whatever means necessary, first against those close to you, and then make you disappear. They would plunge you into an acid bath. Banier says Castro told him he would wind up at the bottom of the Seine, along with his friends Martin d'Orgeval and Pascal Grégory, with their feet in concrete. Castro denies that he ever mentioned acid baths or concrete shoes, but he does admit making dire threats. It's true that I told him he risked being threatened by the mafia the day there would be a suit against him, because there were unscrupulous people who could be interested in recovering what he'd obtained. Nothing more. I didn't go further than that. His aim, he says, was to scare him and bring him to reason. Castro succeeded in his immediate goal. His threats put the fear of God into Banier and nearly pushed him to the edge of madness. Banier immediately dashed off a fax to Liliane, telling her what had happened. He was sure that Castro had been sent by Françoise and her husband, Jean-Pierre Meyers, to frighten him into renouncing Liliane's gifts. Liliane, who was vacationing on her private island, the Ile d'Aros, with André, sent a return fax urging Banier to keep calm. But she railed against her daughter and son-in-law, whom she suspected of being behind Castro's intimidation tactics. Castro told you he was linked with the Chapon, she wrote, using her favorite nickname for her son-in-law, a Chapon being a castrated rooster. Do you believe it, or is it just to annoy you a little more? I send you a big kiss, and please put this incident out of your head. In a separate fax, she wrote, I see red when people don't behave well with me. The jealousy of the other one, Françoise, is a gross jealousy, a real bitch of a jealousy, and badly expressed. So much the better. I send you a tender kiss. This is going to be amusing. Well, the chapter goes on. I'll close off there. But there you have it. So now I'll be happy to take your questions. Yes, ma'am. You can clap, sure. Yeah. You can heckle. Madame. I met Banier and people around him. I didn't actually get to Françoise. Liliane was deep into Alzheimer's, so I didn't get to her. I got to people around Françoise. Lots of lawyers, lots of friends, financial advisors, people at L'Oréal. I really regretted not being able to get to Françoise and Liliane, of course. But I think I have a pretty good idea of her take on the whole situation, and of course Liliane's. How? Françoise gave 4 or 5 interviews over this period to Paris Match and Elle and Le Figaro. So publicly, at least, she voiced her feelings about Banier, and she called Banier a guru and a gigolo and a Rasputin. I mean, she didn't hide her feelings about it. But also, I got access to the entire investigative file, which is not really a public document, but what the hell, I got access to it. In that file, there are really hundreds of depositions, the procès-verbaux, including depositions by Francoise and everybody. Liliane, Francoise, Banier, you name it, everybody who was involved in the case. And lots of domestics. So that was one of the interesting aspects of the story, is the upstairs, downstairs, kind of Downton Abbey aspect of the story. So probably a dozen of the domestic personnel were deposed, and so I had access to all that. So I think I had a pretty good idea of Francoise's take and her thoughts about the whole thing. As far as Liliane is concerned, there were a number of interviews, and a few of them famous interviews with Claire Chazal on the TV interview. Was it France 2? No, TF1? TF1, yeah. Claire Chazal went out to Liliane's mansion in Brittany and did this interview with her, where Liliane really castigated her daughter, and she was very feisty. And so there are these interviews, the procès-verbaux, and one of the most useful documents was were Banier's confiscated notebooks. I mean, Banier's he's an obsessed writer. I mean, if you follow the trial at all, I'm sure you've seen references to his habit of sitting there with a notebook on his knees and just writing all day long through the trials. So he would write down what happened, exchanges between him and Liliane. And because she was deaf, don't forget, Liliane was, as she got older, she was progressively deafer and deafer, and by the time you get into the period of this suit, she was almost totally deaf. She read lips. So when Banier would be out with her at a restaurant, which would often happen, she would wine and dine him, or vice versa, but she always paid. So if they were in a noisy public place, it was difficult for them to talk. Also, they probably didn't want people overhearing. So he had a notebook, and they would write their conversation. He would write her a question, and she'd look at it, and then she'd write back. And there are pages and pages and pages. They're all dated. I mean, it's almost like having a recording transcript of their conversations. Now, consider the source. This is Banier's account, but also her answers. I mean, what I'm talking about is not Banier's account after the fact. I'm talking about an ongoing, real-time conversation. So you see Liliane's handwriting in her. She wrote it. She liked to write with a green felt pen. So you can tell this is Liliane actually writing, and then Banier writing back something that he showed to her. So that was a really invaluable source, even though I was not able to interview Liliane. Pascal Bonnefoy, don't you love his name, Bonnefoy? The devious, squirrely, butler. He got quite a large severance settlement from the Bettencourts, and with that, he and a partner, he bought a hotel in the town of Binic in Brittany, and it happens to be affiliated with the Great Western chain, and he runs that hotel in Brittany. So no flowers, no south of France, but he did leave. So, and I'm told by his lawyer that his secret ambition after all this is over is to return to what he calls servitude. That's the word he uses with Françoise and Jean-Pierre Mayers. That's his goal in life. So. They had a real relationship. It was not physical, because given his sexual orientation and the 25 years between them, but it was a very intense, what I'd call platonic love affair. So it was not simply this guy hustling her out of money. I mean, he got an obscene amount of money, and you or I, after a few tens of millions, might have said, okay, thanks, Liliane, that's okay. But he saw things differently, and I'm not saying he didn't cajole or manipulate her, but the basis of this was actually a very intense personal relationship. Now, the first part of your question is really goes to the heart of the whole legal controversy. And you have to realize, I mean, she's a very wealthy woman. When she died, her fortune, as I said, was worth $45 billion. Early in this process, it was worth somewhat less, but depending on stock price, anyway, it was what, $20-30 billion. So whatever she gave him was a tiny fraction of her whole fortune. Now, the question of whether she was compos mentis, she began, her first donation to him was something like 200,000 francs to subsidize a photo show at the Beaubourg. That was 1991, something like that. So 1991, she was, nobody suggests that she wasn't lucid then. And the first part of this process I think the courts at least established that she was arguably, or let's say medically, of dubious competence, starting in September 2006, after she'd had an accident and hospitalization and affected her awareness and discernment. So everything that she gave him up until 2006 technically was something that was her freedom to give. I mean, she was very wealthy. She was, as long as she was lucid, she was free to give him whatever she wanted. And the question comes in where you try to find out at what point did she lose her powers of discernment, and from that point, then the question of abus de faiblesse becomes active. Now, the interesting thing is that the court experts, medical experts, established this kind of tipping point in September 2006. So when he went to trial, he was only made to answer for gifts that she gave him after that point. So all the other stuff was not on the table, which was hundreds of millions that she gave between 1991 and September 2006. So, yeah. And the other reason he was able to keep some, in other words, to get out of having to pay the $158 million in damages that was assessed at the first trial. Well, that was at the appeal trial. The court ruled correctly on a legal technicality, but it's kind of complicated to go into. But it's based on the deal that they signed. They signed an agreement in December 2010. And although the court continued, the investigative magistrates continued the investigation, that agreement still held. Agreement between the two of them, and one of the provisions of that agreement was that she would not ask for damages, not seek damages from Banier. Francoise would not, and then Liliane was also a party to that agreement. Although at that point, that's a whole question about if that was abus de faiblesse when Banier received money from her. Why was it not abus de faiblesse when Liliane was made to sign this agreement, and also made to pay Francoise's lawyers 12 million euros. So the question of when she was lucid, when did she know what she was doing, and what did she know? It's absolutely a key to the whole litigation. But I think just the bottom line is throughout most of this period, she knew what she was doing. She did it willingly and knowingly, and all of these gifts were declared in front of a notaire, in front of a notary. She paid the taxes due on it, 60%. So when she gave him $10 million, he got $10 million, and she paid an extra, $6 million. And I will say in parentheses that she gave Lindsay Owen Jones, the CEO of L'Oreal, when he retired, she gave him $100 million like that. Thanks a lot, Lindsay. That was not his L'Oreal retirement package. That was a personal gift. And was that abus de faiblesse or what? So there are a lot of gray zones in here. But the question of was she lucid when she gave him the bulk of what she gave him, yes, she was. I think she was lucid, but she put it in writing. She told her lawyers, she told her notaries, "I'm giving this to Mr. Banier because he's been a great help to me in my life. I want to further his artistic career. I'm doing this willingly and knowingly." And so, I mean, this was not just stuff done under the table after he got her drunk, you know, which he may have done a few times.
So, yeah, what happened when you did that?
I don't want to go there. But Francois, talking about the art, she always said it was the gifts were couched in terms of art patronage, and she said she was doing this to finance his art career. And Francoise's answer to that was at one point it looked like he'd gotten €1 billion. It wasn't quite that much, but she said, "Whoever heard of an artist being financed on the level of €1 billion? You know, with €1 billion, you can build the Louvre or the Prado." You know. So, yeah, good question. I think it had. It was one of the casseroles, one of the scandals that contributed to tarnishing his image. And I mean, I'm not saying he lost re-election because of the affair. There were a number of others. There's a whole affair of things that are not resolved yet. The whole thing about Gaddafi's financing of his campaign, that's still under investigation. The wiretap case where he was trying to make a very shady deal with the prosecutor to get information about the Bettencourt Affair. So this was one of the scandals, I think, that kind of tarnished his image and contributed to his election defeat in 2012, and also was part of the mix when he failed to win a nomination of the Les Républicains last year. So it's certainly not a direct and unique cause of his political downfall, but it is, I think it's a contributing factor. Yes, ma'am. Well, actually, 3 people committed suicide. I didn't tell you about all of them. The main was Olivier Metzner, who was famous criminal lawyer, and he's the one who masterminded the whole suit. The complaint was written by him, and he's the one who advised Francoise from the beginning on how to handle the suit. And along the way, when was it? I think. Trying to think of when this happened. Probably 2011 or 2012. He had a private island and just off the coast of Brittany, and he was a big yachtsman. And he went out one morning, very early one morning, alone on a sailboat. And the sailboat was found, and he was never found. Well, he was found later, but by that time he was dead. So he committed suicide, and I don't think it's directly related to this. I think there were a number of personal reasons, which I get into in the book as far as one can, because suicide is always a very private, personal act. He didn't leave a note behind. Well, he did, actually. He didn't say why he was doing it, but he left a note for his housekeeper about who should be contacted at his law firm.
What I really wanted to know is there's somebody that we feel sorry for in this whole saga?
I feel sorry for Metzner. Metzner was a abrasive character, and most of his colleagues don't have much good to say about him. It turns out he was a very lonely, unhappy man. He was a kind of a closet homosexual. He had his social life was how shall I say? It was not a happy. He did not have a happy personal life. And he once told an interview, he once broke down crying in the middle of an interview. He told the interviewer, said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, "I never wanted to be a lawyer." He said, all I ever wanted to do was sail the seas. And he said, I should have been a sailor. And he'd just bought this big yacht. He was going to sail around the world. But he felt like that he'd missed his real calling. And that he was a very successful lawyer, but I think apparently he wasn't happy at that. Well, I don't want to make a ridiculous comparison, but Tolstoy didn't actually choose one or two people. He had a Balzac, for God's sake. But to get back to my level of this craft, that's a good question. You could make, I think, a good book out of Eugene Schueller about his whole career, and then pair that with the corporate history of L'Oreal, which I tried to do to some extent, but on a limited level. I mean, I didn't go into that much detail about L'Oreal. But his career, up from the bootstraps, I mean, he was a real Horatio Alger kind of figure. Very ambiguous figure, and his whole collaboration. But you know, he was a World War I hero. He had 5 battle citations, Croix de Guerre, Légion d'honneur. He was a genuine, bona fide military World War I hero, and he wrote books. I mean, there's a lot of wacky ideas in some of his books about economics, and he was a pro-fascist.
So
But I find him an intriguing. What? Sorry.
Would we like him?
Probably not. Probably not. But I'm not sure that's a prerequisite for liking a book. I mean, you know, what's the talented Mr. Ripley? You know,
Yeah.
nobody likes Mr. Ripley, but you read the books. I mean, I don't think he's exactly like Mr. Ripley, but you know, you can be intrigued by an anti-hero. You know. When she was 20, so you're talking about 20, she was born 1922, so that's 42. In the middle of the war, but be that as it may, Schueller, who is, as you know, did quite well during the war. He was in a period of investment and expansion, and he set up an office, a subsidiary of L'Oreal in Morocco, L'Oréal Maroc, and yeah, right. So she went to Morocco, and I think that was in Marrakesh was where the headquarters were. She went to Morocco in the context of that L'Oreal presence there, and she actually had an apartment. She lived there for a while, and she met at some reception. She met a man named. I hope he's dead now. I mean, I don't hope he's dead, but I hope he does. If he's not, I hope he doesn't hear that I'm about to give you his name. It was Ibrahim Glaoui, and his father was the Pasha of Marrakesh, El Glaoui, and he was a little older than her, and she was just swept off her feet. And by the way, now that she's gone, I'm free to say that she did have a pretty active love life, particularly when she was younger. So I mean, she's not somebody who was just kind of cloistered and then hooked up with Banier because you know he was safe or whatever. She was active in that realm, and she was absolutely enamored of this guy. And they went together for maybe 3 or 4 years. And she wrote. This is one of the things she wrote about in her written conversations with Banier. He asked, well, what happened? Why didn't she stick with him? And she said, well, I really didn't want to marry him. I couldn't marry him because I'm a Christian after all. And obviously he was a Muslim, so she thought that would create problems. I'm not sure that Papa back in Paris would have been too happy about that. But it was maybe the love of her life. Maybe Banier is in a platonic way, but this was a really intense affair. And I think she was very depressed when it broke off. And then she just said basically, well, what the hell, I'll marry Andre. At least he comes from a good family. But Andre really didn't bring a lot to the party, apart from, I mean, he presented well, came from a good family. But as I said, he really was a rather mediocre man when you look at it.
So it would have been a bodice ripper.
Sorry?
A bodice ripper story.
Who's my story?
No, Liliane and the Pasha.
And the Pasha's son. I guess she ripped bodices and, you know, other things. I don't know, but I don't, she didn't get into that level of detail, but I mean, obviously she had an intense affair with him.
Really from the father?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, thank you.